Good evening, friends, and welcome to this event, which is part of the National Quaker Gathering here in Hobart. This lecture is also being live streamed around Australia. My name is Jo Jordan, and I'm the presiding clerk of Quakers in Australia. Each year we conduct the James Backhouse Lecture. James Backhouse, with his companion George Washington Walker, visited Australia from England between 1832 and 1838. They travelled widely, but spent most of their time here in Tasmania. They made careful reports to government officials on penal reform, the rum trade, the treatment of Aboriginal people, and as a result, Quaker meetings began in Australia. This series of lectures is intended to bring fresh insights into the truth. This year's lecture is Animating Freedom, Accompanying the West Papuan Struggle. In 1991, Jason MacLeod, the author of this lecture, travelled to occupied West Papua, and it was a visit which changed his life. Jason will share with us his experiences and his reflections on colonisation, freedom, and accompanying others in that journey. It will conclude with some challenges for all of us. Jason is a member of Queensland Regional Meeting who lives in Jagera and Turrbal country. He's an educator, researcher, and organiser. He works with environmental and social justice movements in Australia, Asia, and Oceania. As is our custom, we will begin with silence, and Jason will speak when he's ready. At the end of the presentation, we'll return to silence before concluding with a shaking of hands. This lecture has been published and it will be available for sale, I believe, in the foyer after the lecture. And you are most welcome to join us for light refreshments in the foyer afterwards.
Rise up, freedom fighter. Rise up and take your stance again. Bird of paradise never die in vain. Melanesia, you may rise up again. For all who live in darkness, can see the great light afar. Dawn of a new day come, with the rise of the morning star. Seagull calling like in a young dream. Some to claim the land and sit with Sorong Samurai. One people, one soul, one destiny. Sorong Samurai. One people, one soul, one destiny. Sorong Samurai. We got to keep on pushing forward. Sorong Samurai. One people, one soul, one destiny. Sorong Samurai. One people, one soul, one destiny. One man, one kulu, satu orang, satu tifa, suara nenek moyang kita, Papua, tanah kami, itu weapon of choice, come back again, like an ex-house boomerang, woman up, Tubia, Serui, Manopari, Temika, Meropetaya Pura, Sorong Samurai, woman up, Tubia, Serui, Manopari, Temika, Meropetaya Pura, Sorong Samurai, Sorong Samurai, one people, one soul, one destiny, Sorong Samurai, Sorong Samurai, we got to keep on pushing forward, Sorong Samurai, one people, one soul, one destiny, Sorong Samurai, one people, one soul, one destiny.
Greetings, friends. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Muinina, people of Nipaluna country, which is Hobart and its surrounds. I'd like to acknowledge all Palawa of Lutruwita, this beautiful island of Tasmania, the elders, past and present, and recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded on the land we are meeting in. I give thanks to Moini, in the language of Palawakani, the indigenous people of Lutruwita, of Tasmania. It's the great creator spirit who cradles us right now as we sit here tonight in the folds of this land with Kunanyi, the mountain, Mount Wellington, on one side, and Timtumili Milanya, the Derwent River, on the other. Wah, 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 wah. To all of you, and to those of you who are watching online. As Joe said, forgive me, Joe. As Joe said, my name is Jason MacLeod, from Brisbane, from Mianjin, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. Before I begin, I just have a couple of thank yous, people I wish to acknowledge. I'd like to thank the members of the Backhouse Lecture Committee who invited me to speak to you tonight. And I want to thank all the friends, Quakers in the room, who in many different ways have nurtured my leading and brought me here before you tonight. There are a few other people I want to acknowledge before I begin. My parents-in-law, Kate and Greg. Thank you for coming all the way from Deloraine in Palatore country to be here tonight. I also want to acknowledge my family, Manon, Luca and Emile, who perhaps, if they got the technology right, might be watching. And I want to give thanks to my comrades who I've journeyed with very closely in preparing this lecture, particularly Biwanko, a proud Malandanam woman from the south of West Papua, Nathan, Vivian and LaDonna in Vanuatu, and Moyu, also West Papua, who've helped shape these words in many, many ways. Another key person who I need to thank is my dear friend Denny. His custom name is Otasi, who first invited me to accompany the West Papuan struggle for freedom. And together in those very early years, we explored what it might take to nurture a nonviolent movement. I also want to acknowledge a couple of other people who sadly are no longer with us, including my dear friend Napi Ferry Marisan, who was buried today in West Papua, close to Arnold App and Eddie Mofu and from Mambasak, who were key cultural leaders who tragically were killed by the Indonesian military. And the many, many other friends who've passed on. Untuk berapa lama mereka hadir? Mereka hadir dengan kita untuk selamanya. untuk selamanya, untuk selamanya. For how long are those who have passed present with us? For always, for always, for always. So tonight, I want to take you on a journey. And it's a journey that's going to take place at two different levels. On one hand, it's going to be a journey about West Papua, the western half of the island of New Guinea, resting above Cape York like a bird of paradise. Its head, the bird's head, pointing out towards Indonesia, and its green, luxuriant tail stretching out to Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. A place that's been forcibly and brutally occupied by the Indonesian state since 1963. But on another level, I'm not going to be talking to you about West Papua. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of what I've learnt about accompanying Indigenous struggles for freedom, Indigenous struggles for self-determination, and what I think they might have to say to us as friends here in Lutruwita, Tasmania and the mainland, a place still deep in denial about the legacies and the effects of colonisation. So I've written a thing, this book, which I hope some of you may perhaps read. And in this, I outline a framework, my own framework for accompanying, for non-violently accompanying Indigenous struggles for freedom. And that framework has 5 different elements in it. The element of earth, which is all about going deeper, about being grounded, about knowing who you are and where you come from. Not just in your own life, not just in your parents' and grandparents' life, or your great-grandparents, or your great-great-great-grandparents, but a many thousand-year journey of who you are. It's also touches on, the framework also touches on the element of air, of vision, a view that can take us out of empire and towards the good life. What my friends in Papua New Guinea call good Sindam, what the West Papuans call Merdeka, or freedom, what Martin Luther King called the beloved community, and what some of you, what some of us might think of as heaven on earth. The framework also touches on the element of fire, which I think of as collective nonviolent action. and the element of water, of holding relationships, and how to structure social movement, the ability to act together as large numbers of people. And finally, the framework touches on the fifth element, spirit, the mystery that pervades all things. Now, I'm in the habit of sometimes talking and writing too much. So I'm not going to talk to you tonight about all those 5 elements. I'm simply going to touch on 2. I'm going to speak about spirit, and I'm going to speak about fire. And then I'm going to say something about soul, about what this might mean for us as friends, as Quakers in particular. There's the framework there, the 5 elements. Spirit. In 1991, I first travelled to West Papua. I was 19 years old. I dropped out of university, not for the first time, and left a law degree behind. I hitched my way up to Cairns and then caught a plane to Port Moresby, capital of Papua New Guinea. I remember there was only one other person of European heritage on the plane, a young guy. And we chatted on the plane and we thought, well, let's walk the Kokoda track together. We were both in search of a bit of adventure. The plane arrived and there was a riot that was taking place outside the airport. So he took one look at what was going on and booked a ticket straight to the Solomon Islands. I eventually made my way up the Kokoda track, a wonderful walk, up and down, and up and down, and up and down, and found myself on the east coast, headed up to Madang, and there I caught a light aircraft to the Ramu River, and I arrived in the Ramu River when there was an all-night party happening, 6 to 6, started at 6, and people danced all through the night to 6 in the morning. It was fantastic. And from the Ramu, I walked across into the Kerem River, which is a long river, about 600 kilometres long. And it flows down from the central mountain chains and joins the mighty meandering Sepik, one of the great rivers of the world. And at the start of the headwaters of the Kerem River, I found some people who were willing to negotiate for a canoe and a paddle. The canoe is a beautiful dugout canoe, hollowed out from a tree. It had a puk-puk. For those of you who speak pidgin would know there's a crocodile head carved on the prow. And my paddle told the story of the village. It took me about a week, I think, before I could stand up and paddle, which is what men are meant to do. For the first week, I couldn't even paddle sitting down. I had to get a couple of banana suckers tied to the or lashed to the canoe to keep it balanced. Eventually, I lost those and slowly made my way down the Kerem River. It was amazing, you know. Crocodiles would pop up beside the canoe. And times hornbills, great flocks of hornbills, would fly overhead, and the beating of their wings made a sound like helicopters. Every evening I'd pull into a village and ask if I could stay. Often I'd look for the village chief, or perhaps there was a mission there or a school teacher. It was an incredible beginning of my journey in Melanesia, a journey that profoundly shaped me. I remember one time I passed through 15 different language groups in one day. Just phenomenal. Eventually I arrived in this village called Kevin village on the banks of the Kerem River. It's about 200 kilometres down from the headwaters. At that time, I was a very, very committed anti-Christian. I'd seen the ways the imperial church had taken sides and divided up territory, had burnt spirit houses, sacred artifacts, and I was deeply upset at these things. Anyway, I arrived, and the family I ended up staying with said, "Oh, you're going to stay for church." And perhaps out of politeness, but if I'm really honest with you, more because at heart, I'm really a conflict avoider, I said yes. At night, as things started to settle down, I started to get this incredible pain in the back of my head. It shot down my spine. I couldn't sleep. It hurt to stand, it hurt to sit down, and my head felt like it was about to explode. I stayed walking around, really not knowing if I was going to make it through the night. Eventually, the dogs started, and the chickens started, and the pigs started, and night started to turn to dawn. And I told the family, I said, "Look, I'm really sick," and they took me to the village headman's house, where I managed to lay down and rest. Within about half an hour, I had vomited and lapsed into a deep coma. Fortunately, miraculously, half an hour's walk away was a health clinic. It was one of 3 health clinics on the Kerem River. So local people picked me up. They carried me to that health clinic. And I spent 3 days in a coma. They pumped me full of quinine. Eventually, I came to and was well enough to walk. The first thing I did when I was better, when I was able to walk, and it took me about a week before I could walk again, so I walked outside. And I walked to the edge of the village. And as I walked, I saw a breadfruit tree. And the breadfruit tree started to call me. And as I got closer to that breadfruit tree, I didn't see the tree. I saw the heart of the tree. And it was this light. It flowed from the tree to the ground, to the river, to the forest, to the sky. It was this unbroken river of light. And I knew then, you know that kind of knowledge where you know deep inside your body? I knew then that all of life was holy, that all of life was interconnected, and that at the very center of things is a love, an abiding love that calls us to life, that calls us to each other, to everything. As Quakers, we talk about God in all people, something of God in all people. And some of us would even go further. Some of us would say there is something of God in all things, even breadfruit trees, even rocks, even the chair you're sitting on, the floor beneath our feet. So the element of spirit is about understanding that, about feeling that, about being carried by that. It's about, I think, becoming apprentice sanguma or swangi, medicine men or women, witch doctors, of knowing how to shape energy and hold energy and work with energy and be transformed by energy and letting that spirit increasingly flow through us. So that breadfruit tree and that element of spirit profoundly affected me, and it made me realize that I was on completely the wrong track. My plan was actually to travel the world in search of one crazy adventure after another, consuming experiences. And at that point, as I was there in Kevin Village, I knew that that's not what life's all about. Life is a joyful obligation to give back to one another. When I left Kevin Village, the people, Chris and Marilyn Mangan, two health workers from Simbu province who saved my life, gave me life. When I left, they gave me gifts. They gave me this beautiful bilum. The brown is the fur, the hair of the couscous, shaped together into thread. And it made me realize that I need to find ways to live in such a manner that my life is joined with that flow, is joined with that spirit. So instead of traveling the world, consuming adventures, experiences, I decided I needed to go home. I needed to go home and I needed to figure out what it means to live life as a joyful obligation, to give back to others. how I could pay back this debt that I could never pay back to these people. So when I travelled back, I went across the north coast, across the border near Vanimo, and I went into West Papua, which all of a sudden made me understand what I needed to do. And I was invited again and again and again to be a neighbour, to try and be a good neighbour to our neighbours in West Papua. Eventually, my friend Denny Yomaki, or Tassi, asked me to work with him and a number of other friends in providing training and education to the nonviolent freedom movement in West Papua. And we worked for many years together. I think we trained over 1,000 people, some of whom went on to train others. And I now continue that work with Biwanko and others, and we're still training. Only 3 weeks ago, I was in West Papua working with 20 women on a 5-day workshop who wanted to explore how to dismantle patriarchy and wage non-violent revolution. Quite an overwhelming and wonderful topic to be immersed in. But over time, that work has started to shape into the work of campaigns, which really is how you build a movement. Movements, social movements, the kind of social movements that transform the world are made up of campaigns. Smaller struggles to achieve particular objectives. And one of those campaigns, going backwards, aren't I? One of those campaigns was the campaign for West Papua to get membership in the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which is a group of 4 countries: Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, and the FLNKS, which is the national, I've got to get this right, it's in French. It's the National Front for the Socialist Liberation of Kanaki, who some of you might know as the colonial name New Caledonia. And they're the 5 places or countries that make up the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which is then part of the Pacific Island Forum, which makes up 16 countries. Now I'm going to start at the end of the story about that campaign, and this is the end. On the left, you'll see Frank Bainimarama. Sitting next to him, so Frank Bainimarama, the Prime Minister of Fiji, somewhat autocratic leader. Manasseh Sogavari, the then Prime Minister and now current Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands. And next to him, Peter O'Neill, who was then Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. So some of you will know that Frank Bainimarama is no friend of West Papua. Throughout the campaign for West Papua to get membership of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, Frank Bainimarama worked very, very closely with the Indonesian government and opposed the West Papuans from beginning to end. And this photo comes from the meeting room in the Heritage Park Hotel in Honiara. And my comrades and I had snuck into that meeting room to hear the decision about whether West Papua would be granted membership in the Melanesian Spearhead Group. Now, when Frank Bainimarama hopped up to speak, given the way he had vigorously resisted the Papuans, I was not prepared for what he was about to say. He hopped up and he said, "We have now brought you back to the family. You are part of the Melanesian Spearhead Group." Now this phrase, bringing West Papua back to the family, was a phrase that my friends and I developed at a meeting with West Papuan leaders in Meanjin, in Brisbane, at the start of this campaign. It was the prayer, the demand, the way we framed the whole campaign for West Papua to come back to the family, to be part of the kin in the Pacific. And here Bainimarama was using our very words and speaking them back to us. I couldn't believe it. And I looked over at the two West Papuan leaders who were about to speak, Oktamote and Beniwenda. And it was just a beautiful sight to behold, their faces alight as that was said. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this campaign, and particularly I want to talk about our understanding of fire, of collective nonviolent action that emerged in the course of this campaign. Now, as Quakers, we're often very much in touch with the ethics of nonviolence. The love your enemy, the morals. But I've come to understand that this is only a very small part, an essential part, but a small part of nonviolent action. I now think of nonviolent action as made up of 4 different dimensions. Going backwards, aren't I? One of these dimensions is dialogue. So this photo it's from 2014, December 2014, in Vanuatu. It's outside Malvatamari, the National Council of Chiefs building in Vanuatu. And my colleague Biwanko and I were part of the facilitation team that worked with Reverend Francois Pihaate, who was then the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches. So whilst the dialogue was happening at the level of state leaders, you know, with those 5 people, so the head of the FLNKS and the heads of Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Solomons and Fiji, there was also this other level of dialogue that was happening, what people sometimes refer to as track 2 dialogue. So this was a dialogue with mid-level leaders trying to understand one another's position and persuade them to support the West Papuans, to bring them back to the family. And a wonderful example of this, I think, is working with the way the people in the Solomon Islands worked with Manasseh Sogavari's daughter to persuade her father, who at that time was sitting on the fence, to support the West Papuan cause. But there's also this other element of dialogue, this track 3 dialogue, which is the dialogue with ordinary people. Because before the Papuans could come together to try and gain membership of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which was part of their journey towards getting a seat at the table in the United Nations General Assembly, before they could do that, before they could form, unify, which they did in this meeting, they actually had to develop consensus amongst the grassroots. And for many years, the kind of non-violence workshops we would do would be with separate groups. It would be with this particular church, with that particular tribal group, with this women's group, with this clandestine political organisation. Until one day, a man, Fakoras Yaboisambut, who at that point was playing a key political role, he asked to meet with us, myself and my colleagues. And he said, I've watched the videos that we'd gotten translated, the videos about Gandhi's movement, about Martin Luther King's movement, about the movement to overthrow Pinochet, about the Danish resistance against the Nazis. He said, I've watched all these videos and I've been following the work you've been doing, but I want you to do it differently. I want you to work with different groups of people who are in conflict with each other. And it's going to be very difficult for you. And he was completely right. I've lost count of the number of times chairs have been thrown across the room or people have stormed out. But it was very, very important advice to work with these different groups who are in conflict with each other. And over time, what happened was that it was young people in particular, young people who were connected to their own constituencies, whether that was a faith constituency or whether that was a tribal or language-based constituency, but they were also connected to their elders, the key political leaders. And these young people from these different factions started to come together. They built relationships of trust and they persuaded their elders to come together, supported by the Vanuatu government, supported by the Malvatamari National Council of Chiefs, and supported by the Vanuatu Council of Churches and the Pacific Conference of Churches, and eventually formed that organisation, the ULMWP, the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, that then became members of the Melanesian Spearhead Group. So that's dialogue. But dialogue's not enough. It holds things together, gets people talking to each other, but it's not enough. You also need strategy. You need a plan. You need a goal, tactics that escalate and build power over time, allies who support your cause. And it was the young people, largely, who developed this amazing strategy to demonstrate that they had the support of the entire country. And unusually, their strategy consisted of one main tactic, which was a paper petition. Now, this doesn't sound much, perhaps it doesn't sound like much to you in this age of Facebook and email where we get petitions all the time, but in West Papua it was a very big thing. It's a very big thing. And they travelled by foot, by boat, by plane, and they walked the length and the breadth of the country, gathering signatures. They gathered 55,000 signatures. Some people couldn't write or didn't write. They weren't literate, so they pressed their thumb. And they didn't just do that, but they also collected their identity cards to give evidence of who they were. And it was not only West Papuans, but it was Indonesians as well who supported it. And they kept on going, even when the communication posts were raided by the police and they were demolished, and those who were staffing them were beaten and thrown into jail. They kept going even when Alexander Nekenham was dragged into the police station and had cigarettes put out his body. They kept going even when Obanam, an elder from Yahukimo up in the highlands, was shot dead by the Indonesian military. Then they made multiple copies and they smuggled them to Honiara and hand-delivered them to each of these 5 leaders. But it wasn't just the grassroots that were mobilised. When the Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, visited West Papua to try and persuade the governor of Papua province, Mr. Lucas Nmba, to side with Indonesia and to stop the West Papuans and to stop this campaign to become members of the Melanesian Spearhead Group. What Lucas Nmba did, was he switched off his mobile phone and he disappeared for 3 days. A stunning example of non-cooperation. Strategy. There it is. People in one of our workshops mapping out their strategy using paper plates. Process what we call critical path analysis. Jalan menuju sukses. But of course, strategy and dialogue are not enough either. You need to cultivate new norms. Norms of unity. Norms of discipline. And at the same time, you need to uphold existing norms so that you're able to speak into the society. In the case of Melanesia, these were norms of family, of being kin. But it was also the norms of nonviolence, of saying, we oppose the occupation. With this hand, we oppose the occupation. But with this hand, we are reaching out to you as Indonesian sisters and brothers in love. And it's those kind of norms that have led to groups like the Front Rakyat Indonesia untuk West Papua, the United Indonesian People for West Papua, or Free West Papua, a group of ordinary Indonesians who support West Papua's right to self-determination, who travelled to West Papua and publicly apologised, who wept for their role in perpetuating the occupation through silence, through ignorance, through inaction. Dialogue, strategy, normative action. It's a powerful, powerful combination. But there's one other dimension. Utopian enactment. How do we live in such a way as if the world we long for is already present amongst us? How do we live in such a way as if we're already family? How do we communicate through drama, through emotions, through art, through music? in ways that shift people's enemy images of one another, that awaken the energies of love, of solidarity, of family. And these three things work together. Strategy might be your plan. Dialogue is the way you communicate it. It's what holds all the other elements together. The normative action is also about building the kind of world that you long for in the midst of the struggle, forming, in this case, parallel governments, and forming hybrid organisations that actually build on Indigenous governance systems. And normative action then also speaks to this utopian enactment of kind of living as if the world we long for is already breaking through, of using drama, of emotion. I now want to come to the conclusion, and I want to say a little bit about soul here, and what these kind of things might mean for us as Quakers and as people present, alive in these dying times that we're living in. I want to say two things here. The first thing, friends, is we have leadings, we have concerns, we have testimonies, but sometimes I feel that we have been possessed by a spirit of neoliberal fatalism, by this idea that we can't affect change, by this idea of individualism, that it's just enough if I follow my leading or my concern, or if I support someone else to follow their leading or their concern. Or if I try in my own way to live out our testimonies of peace, of simplicity, of equality, of community, earth care. I want to suggest that I don't think this is enough. And I actually don't think this is what Quakers are all about. Our testimonies, particularly in the early days, were an expression of the whole society, acting in concert together. We are called a society, friends. So my question for all of us is, what might we do together to undo colonialism, to dismantle empire, to move towards the good life? What might we do together? And can we make a commitment to act together before we decide what it is we might do together? Can we make a commitment to act together? And what are the processes that might help us come to that place? The second thing I want to say to you is that faith is wonderful. But what would it be like if we had faith and strategy, and that we were able to hold these two things together in creative tension? sometimes I feel like we are caught in magical thinking. That a letter will somehow create action, that a vigil will somehow communicate. Now, I'm with you, friends. I do believe that the Spirit of God moves amongst us and that we are not the sole authors of our destiny. But sometimes this is an excuse for us not to plan, for not to think about how we build power. That dirty word, power. Power of love, power of fire, power of collective action. What might it take for us to do something together and to do that strategically? Is there a breadfruit tree in your life? How is the Spirit speaking to you? Can you imagine walking out from empire, which is war in the most concentrated form, towards the good life? Where is the breadfruit tree in your life, friends?